In my most recent video, Postmodern Woo, link in the description, I offered as an example of postmodernists' abuse of scientific terminology the following passage from Jean Baudrillard's The Illusion of the End. Our complex metastatic viral systems, condemned to the exponential dimension alone, be it that of exponential stability or instability, to eccentricity and indefinite fractal scissorparity, can no longer come to an end. Condemned to an intense metabolism, to an intense internal metastasis, they become exhausted within themselves and no longer have any destination, any end, any otherness, any fatality. They are condemned precisely to the epidemic, to the endless excrescences of the fractal, and not to the reversibility and perfect resolution of the fateful. We know only the signs of catastrophe now, we no longer know the signs of destiny. And besides, has any concern been shown in chaos theory for the equally extraordinary, contrary phenomenon of hyposensitivity to initial conditions, of the inverse exponentiality of effects in relation to causes, the potential hurricanes which end in the beating of a butterfly's wings? In response to my characterization of this passage as pompous word salad more befitting a New Age swindler than an esteemed academic, several scandalized spectators who are either sympathetic to Baudrillard specifically or to postmodern philosophy more generally insisted that I was being unfair in my dismissal of this patent nonsense. Baudrillard's appropriation of scientific terminology in service of his critiques of certain popular accounts of history was not, as I had implied, the result of a vain intellect attempting, with hysterical results, to showcase erudition in fields with which the author had no familiarity. The invocation of, among other things, control theory, catastrophe theory, and chaos theory was not the result of Baudrillard's desire to pimp up his basic thesis on the topics of history and society with the kudos of scientific rigor, and the attendant pretensions to multidisciplinary scholarly insights. No, Baudrillard's abuse of scientific terminology was perfectly licensed by the fact that the signs which constitute various scientific theories may be repurposed in such a manner that they may be reinterpreted metaphorically, and that from these metaphors a deep and insightful account of history and society may be extracted. My insistence that the scientific terminology being appropriated be used appropriately is, according to my interlocutors, excessively pedantic on my part. This video is a response to such sentiments, and I will begin by making it clear from the outset what my opinion is with regard to the function of metaphors and of scientific terminology. First, within an explanatory context, as opposed to an artistic one, the function of a metaphor is to offer clarity by invoking similarities between that which one seeks to explain and that which, by virtue of being familiar to the intended audience, makes the thing being explained more relatable. For example, in my Quantum Theory Made Easy series, I often make use of similar rhetorical devices for the purpose of clarifying the often highly complex and intricate theories which underpin subatomic phenomena. By comparing generally unfamiliar concepts, like the relation between a photon's change in wavelength and its scattering angle when subjected to the Compton effect, to intuitive everyday scenarios, like the relation between the angle of a car collision and the severity of the accident, the otherwise alien concept becomes rehabilitated in the minds of those for whom the comparison is intended. Thus, the principal function of such rhetorical devices, when one is engaged in the business of explaining an idea or concept, is to offer clarity to the intended audience. The opposite of clarification, of course, is obfuscation, such as when one attempts to explain such mundane phenomena as car collisions by invoking esoteric concepts like Compton scattering as a point of comparison. We will return to obscurantism of this sort momentarily. With regard to scientific terminology, I understand the function of technical language to be the facilitation of efficient communication, often by using jargon in place of otherwise tedious signifiers, especially when the concept being referred to is brought up repeatedly, and even more so when several such concepts are conjoined. It is easier to say Compton scattering is an example of inelastic collisions than it is to say the phenomenon whereby individual units of light collide with charged particles such that the resulting change in the structure of the former is predictable in terms of its angle of deflection from the latter is a subset of the phenomena whereby things that hit other things transfer some of their energy in the process. Even though these two sentences say the same thing, one of them is much more compact and efficient than the other. Thus, scientific terminology, whose function is to ease communication when discussing elaborate and complex matters, should not be used as decorative ornaments, at least not within an explanatory context. It goes without saying that poets are exempted from my standards concerning scientific terminology and metaphors. I know, how very magnanimous of me. Baudrillard is not engaging in poetry here. The text from which this passage is taken purports to give an account of the inadequacy of the categories produced by our discourses, rather than to express the author's feelings and emotions via romantic language and creative wordplay. The problem isn't that I don't understand the words that he's using. I know what they all mean. The problem is that their application, and especially their conjunction with one another, does nothing to clarify Baudrillard's opinions, or even convey them in an efficient and effective manner. This passage is simply obscurantism par excellence. As such, I maintain that there was no excuse for him to write something like this. Nevertheless, defenders of this drivel will be inclined to insist that some kind of meaning may still be extracted from it. One commenter in particular left a very lengthy reply in which he deciphered this screed as essentially saying that the concepts that we create with our language are imperfect by virtue of the fact that the means by which we categorize concepts will always contain exceptions, for which we must then generate new categories ad infinitum. Consequently, the reality that we attempt to characterize in terms of our imperfect categories will always be represented imperfectly to some degree. For example, we might define a car as any motor vehicle that stands on four wheels. However, some types of cars, like certain Formula One racers, have more than four wheels, and some cars, like those that compose a maglev train, don't have wheels at all, so we might be tempted to generalize the definition of car to any motor vehicle, period. We immediately run into problems with this definition, however, once we remember that submarines, fighter jets, and helicopters are also vehicles with motors. We might then try to insist that cars must be defined as motor vehicles which neither fly nor swim, but then our definition would include such things as elevator cars, the cars of a roller coaster, and cable cars. So then we might impose the additional definitional constraint that a car must be any grounded motor vehicle whose operation isn't bounded by rails. Under this definition, Segways, 18-wheelers, motorized monowheels, and military tanks are all cars. The point is that in the real world, there is no such thing as a perfect category that encapsulates every element of a set that you want to include while simultaneously banishing every potential element that you want to exclude. You are always going to have to invent new, ever more elaborate categories in order to be able to communicate. That is the essence of what Baudrillard meant to express. The general idea isn't that complicated, and with the assistance of the example of cars, may be easily understood by any thinking person. Contrast this with the manner by which Baudrillard attempts to describe the concept, which we will do by deciphering this junkyard of a paragraph in the manner done by the dissident commenter. Complex refers to concepts that are composed of many interconnected parts. Metastatic evokes the unstable, almost cancerous growth of the number of categories used to describe such concepts in an effort to compensate for the imperfection of extant categories. Viral refers to the rapid manner in which these concepts and categories are spread across society. The condemned to the exponential dimension alone bit invokes control theory without actually drawing any meaningful connections between the field and Baudrillard's ideas, but approximately refers to the aforementioned unstable growth that characterizes the contrivance of new categories. Eccentricity refers to the manner in which exceptions continuously crop up in response to our attempts to categorize concepts. Indefinite fractal refers to the perpetual recurrence of these exceptions despite our continual creation of new categories to account for them, resulting in the production of increasingly elaborate and precise concepts. Scissoparity evokes the image of a cell splitting into two, repeating yet again this idea of the perpetual creation of new categories as old ones are found to be inadequate. The next two sentences repeat yet again the perpetual nature of this process, evoking cancerous imagery even more. The sentence that follows, like the portion concerning control theory, draws no meaningful connection to catastrophe theory, and might just be a play on words such that catastrophe may also be interpreted demotically. And the final sentence is complete gibberish, not least of which because it misunderstands the meaning of hypersensitivity to initial conditions, which has almost nothing to do with exponentiality of effects in relation to causes. Hypersensitivity to initial conditions simply means that multiple deterministic systems with nearly identical starting conditions can nevertheless produce radically different trajectories. This simulation showcases three double pendula that each have the almost exact same starting positions and initial momenta, but nevertheless veer off into completely different trajectories. Note that these three double pendula are not interacting with one another. They are three isolated systems superposed over one another to aid in your visual comprehension. Each double pendulum is governed by the exact same deterministic laws of physics, yet each produces radically different motion. The minuscule differences in their initial conditions is what allows such differences to manifest, despite their near-identical starting conditions. This is hypersensitivity to initial conditions, and in conjunction with certain mathematical properties that lie beyond the scope of the current discussion, is characteristic of the types of systems encountered in chaos theory. The reason that chaos theory doesn't concern itself with hyposensitivity to initial conditions is because such a thing is already covered by Newtonian physics. If two systems with near-identical starting positions and momenta end up producing near-identical trajectories, then you're operating in a regime where the systems can be understood in terms of elementary classical physics, and there's no need to invoke the tools of chaos theory. So even if the application of chaos theory as a metaphor for something meaningful were being employed here, it would be utterly useless in this context because it's being represented incorrectly. Let us pretend, however, just for the sake of argument, that Baudrillard had invoked these various mathematically intense theories in such a manner that meaningful parallels could be drawn between the semantic implications of anti-essentialism and things like control theory, catastrophe theory, and chaos theory. Who would such a discussion be meant for? Is Baudrillard writing for a mathematically gifted audience who are so thoroughly steeped in their research, so disconnected from everyday life, that his invocation of their terminology would prove more intuitive and easy for them to understand than my example involving cars would? Or is Baudrillard simply hoping that the humanities-oriented individuals who constitute the overwhelming majority of his readership will be awed by his apparent erudition and won over by a basic thesis that speciously cloaks itself with esoteric mathematical jargon? I hope that my opinion on this matter is clear. If you think that I'm being too harsh or too dismissive, then let's play a little game. I'm going to engage in a nuanced, trademark, and sophisticated, trademark, analysis of some statements by Dr. Woo himself, Deepak Chopra, and using a similar kind of decryption as what's on offer by those postmodern apologists who mistake incoherence for depth, I'm going to turn this New Age swindler into a respectable postmodern academic. This should be fun. To start things off, here is Mr. Chopra clarifying his metaphorical applications of quantum mechanics.
So a shift in consciousness causes a shift in biology.
Okay. Especially in the immune system or
No, in overall homeostasis.
Okay. Yes.
Homeostasis allows for spontaneous healing mechanisms to work.
Right. But where did the quantum theory come into that?
Oh, it's just a metaphor, just like an electron or a photon is an indivisible unit of information and energy. A thought is an indivisible unit of consciousness.
Of course, Chopra does more than that. He seems to believe that quantum mechanisms are, at some level, implicated in the macroscopic phenomena that he likes to talk about, and may be used to help explain them, though his simultaneous use of both metaphors and literalism does muddy the waters.
Quantum leaps, for example, are examples of discontinuity, and creativity in consciousness is also an example of discontinuity, and that healing may be a biological phenomenon that relies on biological creativity, that at very fundamental levels it may be a discontinuous phenomenon. It's something unpredictable that happens in the proliferation of uncertainty.
So it sounds like a sort of poetic use of the word discontinuity, or it was taking two very different kinds of discontinuity and muddling them up.
Maybe that's your interpretation, but I've spoken to some really good physicists who feel that quantum physics is unexplainable in the absence of consciousness, in the absence of, you can't explain things like observer effect, and that the discontinuity, in fact, may be consciousness itself.
Regardless of what Chopra actually believes, whether his application of quantum terminology is meant to be purely metaphorical or is tinged with suggestions of literal applicability, a potential apologist for Chopra's abuse of scientific language already has an out when confronted by this woo-woo. They may simply retort that an apparent abuse of quantum terminology, or an apparent extension of quantum physics into regimes where it doesn't belong, is simply meant to be taken metaphorically, and that you need to read between the lines in a nuanced, sophisticated manner, instead of being an insufferable pedant. So I'm going to do just that. Let's start with what he just said. Quantum leaps are examples of discontinuity, and creativity in consciousness is also discontinuity. Healing may be a biological phenomenon that relies on biological creativity, that at very fundamental levels, it may be a discontinuous phenomenon and something unpredictable that happens in the proliferation of uncertainty. Translation. As with quantum leaps, wherein electrons will jump from orbital to orbital without crossing the space in between, leaps in creativity involve jumping from mundane ideas to creative ones without engaging in any logical process to bridge the two. Such leaps may be influenced by such things as the placebo effect, wherein the mere act of believing in the efficacy of a treatment can aid in the healing process. This is an example of the brain getting creative and healing the rest of the body without the aid of any genuine medical or therapeutic intervention. As with quantum uncertainty, wherein the expression of mutually incompatible variables limits the precision with which a subatomic system's properties can be known, the placebo effect limits the patient's ability to know whether the properties of the placebo they're receiving are genuine or not. Despite this, placebos have the capacity, under certain conditions, to be effective. This is a nuanced and sophisticated insight on the role played by hyperreality in shaping even something as apparently objective as our physical health. Let's do some more, this time from Deepak's debate with Michael Shermer and Sam Harris.
You know, when you're thinking right now, 100 trillion neurons are phase locking and frequency locking simultaneously. Is that non-locality or not?
Okay, can I...
Translation. Now, obviously, when Deepak mentioned 100 trillion neurons, a pedantic skeptic might point out that the average human being has closer to about 100 billion neurons. However, the Caltech Beckham Auditorium, where this debate was held, has a seating capacity of about 1,000, so in actual fact, there were approximately 100 trillion neurons in the room. What Deepak is clearly saying here is that the minds of everyone present in that auditorium were connecting by virtue of their participation in the discussion, and that the situation could be likened to quantum non-locality, wherein subatomic systems that are apparently unable to physically influence one another due to relativistic constraints nevertheless interact. Everyone's minds, despite being apparently tucked away in brains that are spatially separated from one another, nevertheless influence one another as people think and talk, making it a perfectly valid metaphor, as well as a nuanced and sophisticated insight about human interaction.
In the absence of a conscious entity, the moon remains a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup.
Deepak, that is...
Translation. The concept of the moon, like all other concepts, is discursively constructed. Like all other signs, the signs corresponding to the moon are meaningless in the absence of a discourse to contextualize them, so in the absence of conscious entities, and thus discourses, the concept of moon becomes every bit as ambiguous and unknowable as the most complex of quantum systems. This is a nuanced and sophisticated insight into the metaphysical implications of postmodern semiotic analysis.
A new understanding of science, a new understanding of the perennial wisdom traditions, otherwise called woo-woo, actually can lead to more compassion, to more love, to more kindness, to more tolerance, to more peace, to more insight, to more inspiration, to more creativity. So we become the conscious beings through which the universe will take its next leap in evolution. Spirituality-imbued science will actually lead to science healing the ecosystem, the restoration of species, social justice, and the removing of poverty. So I think it's very important to bring a deep spiritual knowing of inseparability, love, compassion, kindness, and peace into our science. You have given us this opportunity that you have to stop being the jihadists and the Vatican of conservative and orthodox science, which is not relevant anymore.
Translation. A new, more inclusive version of science that discards the phallogocentric views of the West and embraces a plurality of ways of knowing will ultimately result in a better world. This is a nuanced and sophisticated insight into the shortcomings of the scientific meta-narrative and a way forward for postmodern science. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Woo, esteemed academic and postmodern extraordinaire. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. If you really liked it, go ahead and subscribe, and hit the bell next to the red button so that YouTube notifies you of when I upload. If you'd like to see your name in the credits of future productions, I'll link my Patreon in the description box below. Until next time, KC out.